So I'll get started. Chapter 14. This book does not emphasize it, but one of the books I've taught from when I started teaching at this school says that the period of the 1850s was a period of like a foreshadowing of doom, that a lot of persons living then had a sense that something really, really bad was about to happen. Your book does not mention that or emphasize it, and of course none of us know the future, but yet a lot of people seem to have had a sense of impending something, the country is not right and something bad is going to happen to the country. John Brown, your book opens up with a big about John Brown. Ask the question, was he crazy? Folk, about 40 years ago, WSB would carry Mystery Theater, and it was the most unpopular show in Atlanta, but one of its subjects for one of its shows was John Brown. Was John Brown crazy?
Blake Harris.
He had been married, what's that?
That's Blake Harris.
He'd been married twice, he had 20 children, but everything he had tried to do had been wrong. In 1856, he slaughtered 5 men at Pottawatomie Creek, Pottawatomie, Kansas, located on Pottawatomie Creek. He believed that they were pro-slavery. He did not actually prove his case against them, but he believed it, and he killed 5 men. The government of Kansas did not make any move against him, even though the government knew he had killed the men. Didn't make any move against it. So he went to Maryland. He seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Maryland, and got all those rifles. He believed that the blacks the slaves, would rush to his side and he would lead a slave rebellion of slaves against their masters. It didn't happen because the slaves were afraid that they'd be killed in the uprising. So the slaves did not rebel. John Brown was overcome by, among them, Robert E. Lee. Colonel Robert E. Lee was sent to get to get to John Brown. And Jackson was involved too, a man who later was called Stonewall Jackson. John Brown and several of his followers were hung for treason. All right. Here was a big issue that came about as a result of the Mexican War. In 1846, the United States got a whole lot of territory from Mexico. Now, the issue, should these territories be allowed to become slave territories, or should slavery be outlawed? Congress had faced this issue before. In the case of Ohio, which was a new territory, not one of the original 13 colonies. In the case of Ohio, slavery was outlawed in Ohio. Slavery was outlawed in Indiana and Illinois and Michigan, those northern states. The Missouri Compromise had been passed in 1820. The problem with the Missouri Compromise, though, was these territories that we took from Mexico had not been part of the United States up until that time. So did the Missouri Compromise apply to conditions as they were in 1846, 26 years later? That was an issue that the people at that time fought over. A man named David Wilmot. David Wilmot had the idea that slavery should not be allowed in any of the new territories that the United States had just taken from Mexico. Well, at this time, the number of slave states outnumbered the free. But nevertheless, in the House of Representatives, there were far more congressmen, far more representatives who were anti-slave than who were pro-slave. So the Wilmot Proviso passed in the House. But if you know anything about the United States Constitution, it had to pass in the Senate. Since the Senate had more slave senators than were against slavery, the Wilmot Proviso did not pass in the Senate. But it really upset a lot of Southerners that people could get up a bill like this and say, this shows that those Yankees are against us. Those Yankees do not understand us. They simply they'd do away with slavery if they could. So this created a lot more hatred between the North and the South. Now, there were other issues involved. Okay. There are issues that separate issues such as the tariff, issues such as internal improvements, how much money the government should be able to spend on internal improvements, and the issue of nullification. Should states have the right to nullify laws they didn't like? Should states be free to leave the Union if they wanted to leave? All these issues separate the North and South. And for many years, a lot of Southern historians tried to say that the real issue that caused the Civil War was the issue of states' rights. They were trying to downplay slavery. But then more Southern and Northern historians alike have done research, and they have decided that the real number one issue at the time was slavery. Yes, these other things were there, banking, tariff, states' rights, but the number one issue that separated two sides was slavery. In the North, the population was booming, owing to the fact that northern families had more children than Southern families, and also most of your immigrants coming from abroad were heading to the North, and the reason was slavery. A man coming from Europe might decide, well, hey, I can't compete against slave labor. I don't have a chance to find a job in the South. I'm going to head north where there's manufacturing industry, and I might be able to find a job, or I have a better chance of finding a job there. So the North was getting the most immigrants, and the northern families were having the most children. So the northern people outnumbered the southern, and folks, this is going to become very important, because the number one reason, I mean, again, I don't mind saying it, I think all of you already know the South lost the war. I mean, I'm not breaking any news to you, I don't think, but I think you already know that. But the number one reason was the South was hopelessly outnumbered from the beginning. And again, Southern women and men often married later than, except for the very wealthy, but they married later than Northern men and women. Anyway, in 1848, the Congress met, and it was leading to some of the most contentious Congresses in all of history. Well, Calhoun was from South Carolina. I mentioned him last time. He said that Congress had no right to tell a slave owner that he could not take his slaves with him when he moved into these new Western territories. And his view was shared by a whole lot of other Southerners. And if you research it, Calhoun also believed that the black man was not as smart as the white and would never excel. Now, folks, again, this was him, you understand. I'm not promoting anything like this at all myself, but you need to understand what he believed in order to understand why he acted the way he did. Well, there was an election in 1848. Both parties were split. The Whigs had a faction who wanted an end to slavery. There was another faction who wanted compromise. The President Polk, who was sick at the time, he had worked himself to death. He only lived a short while after leaving office, the first president to probably work himself to death, if you excuse William Henry Harrison. The President Polk refused to have his name submitted for reasons of health. So the Democrats nominated Lewis Cass. The Whigs did not nominate Clay, who wanted it, and it was a terrible blow for Clay to swallow, because Clay was at this point up in years and knew he might never live to see another election. Anyway, the Whigs finally chose Zachary Taylor. They had won in 1840 with a general, so they decided to pick a general. Zachary Taylor, all right, this might mean more to me than it is to you, but many years ago, when I was as young as you, there was a famous actress named Elizabeth Taylor. Zachary Taylor had a daughter named Elizabeth.
So that was his daughter, his daughter, right?
Yeah, actually, these movie actors and actresses would often, and still do, take pen names. You know, Marilyn Monroe was not her real name, but she named herself after a president, Monroe. And Elizabeth, anyway, leaving that. Zachary Taylor was a Louisiana man, a Southerner, who had a large plantation and owned 300 slaves. The Southerners thought they had their man in office, but as was a case of General Andrew Jackson, once in office, he became a different man than what he had been before, and he did not always side with the Southerners on a lot of their issues. Anyway, Zachary Taylor won the election, but it was a very close, hard-fought election. Now, there was another party in the election called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was, well, what the name implies. They were anti-slavery. Free soil against slavery. It nominated former President Martin Van Buren to be its, the Free Soilers made slavery their #1 issue, but they did not win in any states. They got no electoral votes. Both parties, though, were shaken as a result of what happened.
Sir, what's the difference between free soil and free labor? Right, it's free labor. I see our book highlights free labor, and then the back of it talk about support.
I don't think there was any difference here. There's just free labor. Oh, wait a minute. You know what? You've got me stumped. I'm sorry.
No, because right here is right in that same where it highlights, the book highlights like free labor, but like a sentence before that said many supported free soil by which they meant territory, west of whatever. Is not
okay, the territory through from Mexico would be free soil. Yeah, that was a free soil. They were against slavery.
Okay.
And then free labor might have been the same thing. Labor that was free to move about. It was voluntarily whether they could work or not work, unlike the slave. Now, in 1848, your book doesn't mention this here, but I'll mention it. Gold was discovered in California. California went through a period of lawlessness, as everybody. Yeah. But a California gold rush, and the California 49ers, because it came in 1849, not everybody, but a lot of young men rushed to California. Shootings were common, outlaw gangs were common, and they realized in order to bring some law and order, we've got to get a constitution. So they decided to apply for statehood. But the people who went to California, the men, were overwhelmingly anti-slave. And they knew that California would never adopt a slave constitution. So California had to wait because too many people in the South, too many pro-slave people would not let California in. So California had to wait. And then Henry Clay, hi. Your book doesn't use this term, so I'm going to write it down, but there was called a triumvirate. Now, if you study world history, you know that Rome had 2 triumvirates, basically 3 men. In the Congress of 1850, 3 men were prominent, and they were all, at this time, old men. They'd all been around for a good many years. Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. Henry Clay favored compromise. Henry Clay was a Kentuckian, somewhat in the middle. Webster was from New England. He favored compromise also. He felt he wanted to save the Union at all costs. And the other one was John C. Calhoun, who said, the Union cannot hold together. I see now the Union's going to have to split. Webster believed that if the Union split, it would mean a big war, which, of course, as we know, is what happened. Neither one of these 3 men lived to see the war. Henry Clay, though, for the last time in his life, he'd already worked up 2 compromises, finally worked up a 3rd compromise. Now, another name for the Compromise of 1850 is the Omnibus Bill. Originally, it was sent to Congress as one big bill that would compromise, but then when it failed to get through Congress, they resubmitted it as 6 different pieces of legislation. There was no way to get this bill through Congress, though, because the president at the time, Zachary Taylor, opposed it, let the Congress know he'd veto it. The government was very divided. But Taylor died suddenly. His death made a lot of news because our history books when I was a kid said he had drank too much lemonade on a hot day. Keep in mind this was before the invention of the air conditioner, and the heat in Washington D.C. can get really hot. His death, about the time you people were being born, about 1988, 89, and 90, Taylor made news because some people believed that he was poisoned. So they actually exhumed his body, dug him back up, and did the test on him and decided no, he was not poisoned. He probably was killed by his doctors who administered him. And when he became sick, they treated him the wrong way. But anyway, he died suddenly. The new president, Millard Fillmore, took over and he signed the legislation. It was no longer the omnibus bill, but he signed 6 pieces of legislation. Essentially, I don't remember to memorize all 6, but some of the main provisions of the Compromise of 1850 was that California would be admitted as a free state. The rest of the territories would be admitted then without any restrictions on slavery. That was part of the compromise. Now, obviously, that did not last. For instance, Utah did not want to come in as a slave state, but Utah was not going to be allowed in any way because of their practice of polygamy. Texas would be reduced in size, but the federal government would take over its debts. Don't worry about that one so much. But one thing, a lot of people were really embarrassed when the ambassadors would come in from Europe, particularly, France sent an ambassador to Washington, and so did Great Britain. These ambassadors would see slaves being bought or sold in the auction, and a lot of people were embarrassed this, so they passed, part of the compromise was that there would be no more slave trade allowed in the District of Columbia. Now, slavery was still permitted in the District of Columbia, but they could not buy or sell slaves in the District of Columbia. This, again, this was an embarrassment to a lot of people in Washington who felt like that these foreigners that had outlawed slavery should not see this. And especially, most of Latin America had outlawed slavery. Most of the whole world had outlawed slavery. The only major countries that still had it was the United States and Brazil. But the world was turning against it. Anyway, they would abolish slave trade. The other last provision I want you to know, that they would have a fugitive slave law. In other words, a law that said if slaves were found, they were to be returned to their owners. Fugitive Slave Act, which Millard Fillmore enforced. Now, it sounds like it was bad, but only a few slaves actually returned. For one thing, a lot of slaves went to Canada. And for another, a lot of these former slaves would move into a neighborhood, and their white neighbors would sometimes protect them or prevent them from being returned. But then again, a lot of them were returned. And a lot of people would wake up one morning and find that some of their neighbors were gone, and they knew they'd been caught and sent back to the South to be slaves again. Anyway, shortly after the Compromise of 1850 was passed, all 3 of these men in the triumvirate, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John Calhoun, had passed on. Calhoun was already so weak that he had to have one of his aides read his message to Congress. He was not even able to stand up anymore. But anyway, they all 3 had passed on and did not live to see what actually happened. Yes?
The Compromise of 1850, what was that about again?
California came in as a free state. The Fugitive Slave Law was passed. And slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia. That's the main 3. Now, there were some others, but the main 3. Texas would come in as a slave state.
So that wasn't the omnibus bill?
That was part of it. Yeah, the omnibus bill, that was part of it. Yeah, Texas would come in. And another one, very important. All the other territories that we'd taken from Mexico were to come in as slave states. California was free, but the other territories would come in as slave states. including Texas, New Mexico. Again, this was all part of the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise was opposed by extremists on both sides. Again, if you know anything about what the word compromise means, it means that each side gives in a little so that you come to some kind of an agreement. And I'm not saying it's wrong. In democracy, you have to be willing to compromise. You don't compromise your convictions, but sometimes you have to vote on a compromise just to keep down the turmoil. And compromises are sometimes important even in marriages, in family situations. But there have been persons who have criticized the whole idea of compromise, saying, no, you should never compromise. Each of you can decide for yourself what you think of that. Now, in the meantime, there was a young woman, I mentioned her last time, but your book mentions her this chapter, Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She had never seen a plantation. Again, keep in mind in those days, travel was slow. And they did have the train by this time. They did not have the automobile, and the trains only go where the rails are. But she had never seen a plantation, but she had heard about them, and she wrote a book about a slave named Uncle Tom, and that described. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin has been controversial. The history books I was taught from said it exaggerated, that the beatings were not, they tried to play down the beatings and the cruelty. But then as we've done more research, we have found that these beatings actually went on and cruelty actually was practiced. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was looked on as being extreme at one time. A lot of northern people, though, praised it before the war. A lot of southerners hated it. Former slaves began to speak up about how badly they were treated. A lot of other writers produced other works against slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin was made into a play. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most read book from the time it was published until the year 1900, other than perhaps the Bible. People read it and reread it over and over again. It did a lot to stir up hatred. And many years later, when Harriet Beecher Stowe visited Abraham Lincoln at the White House, he said to her, so you're the little miss who started this war. If she had not written the book, though, it was inevitable that somebody else would. All right. Now we go to the election of 1852, and again, this was the election under very, very strenuous circumstances. There's a story one time that Daniel Webster argued with the devil, and Webster won his argument with the devil, so the devil decided to get back at him. So the devil made us some predictions that, Mr. Webster, your sons will never follow in your footsteps. He said, well, Daniel Webster said, they'll be my sons anyway, whether they do or not. And they said, Mr. Webster, you will never become president of the United States. Though men who are lesser than you are will make it, you yourself will not. One of the lesser men who made it was Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was picked by his party because his party could not agree on anyone better. The better men were they all had too many people against them. So the Democrats chose Franklin Pierce in the election of 1852. Franklin Pierce was a dough-face. So was a man after him, two dough-faces. Now, that's not necessarily a derogatory term. What it simply meant was he was a northern man who had southern leanings. So the northern people would vote for him because he was from the north, hopefully. The southern people would vote for him because they saw that he really was sympathetic toward them. So the next two presidents at this time, both Pierce and Buchanan, were dough-faces, northern men with southern leanings. Abraham Lincoln was the first true northern man who was anti-slavery to be elected. Anyway, Franklin Pierce was chosen The Whigs chose General Scott, hoping they'd win with a general like they'd done in 1840 and 1848. But the Whigs were hopelessly divided, and the party went out of existence at this point. A lot of Whigs by the thousands became Republicans, among them a man named Abraham Lincoln. Franklin Pierce, well, sadly, his wife did not like Washington living, and his wife never wanted to be elected. On the trip from New Hampshire, where he's from, to Washington, their wagon turned over and one of his sons was killed. Sad to say, Franklin Pierce spent a lot of his time in the White House drunk. He had a problem with alcoholism that he never overcame. But he set his attention on expansion. He tried to get Cuba. He made a clumsy effort at getting Cuba and actually got Spain angry at us. This eventually was to lead to a war with Spain many years after Franklin Pierce had died. We fought the Spanish-American War, but that was to come later. But he provoked a lot of hostilities between the United States and Spain. The one thing he did get, though, was a little bit of territory in the southern part of what's today New Mexico and Arizona, called the Gadsden Purchase, because the man who negotiated was Gadsden. Partly, we gave Mexico millions of dollars for a land that was really worth only a desert. Not worth much, but we felt like we owed Mexico because a lot of Americans felt badly about the way we treated Mexico after the war. So we paid millions of dollars for a bunch of land because the land would be easy to put a railroad through. However, immediately Northerners rose up. They'd vote for, we're outside this territory, but they would not let a railroad go through, and the railroad never did go through this territory. But partly because they said this would make it easier for Southern people to move their slaves into these new territories. We wanted a railroad to go to the Pacific Ocean. Eventually we got three of them, a northerly route, a middle route, and a southerly route. But each section, Stephen Douglas wanted the railroad to start at Chicago, his home state of Illinois, and other people wanted the railroad to start from Missouri, the central part of the United States, and others wanted to start from New Orleans, way down in the south. But eventually we got all three, basically. Now, this takes us up to Stephen Douglas. He became a prominent character in this part of this territory. I have mentioned him earlier that both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln courted the same girl, and this girl wanted to become First Lady, and she chose Abraham Lincoln over Douglas, and to this day we can't tell why. Everyone in their right mind would have thought that Douglas had a much better chance of becoming President of the United States than Abraham Lincoln, but the fortunes of the way the political ball rolls, you can never tell which way the political ball is going to bounce. Anyway, Stephen Douglas, he began to espouse the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty said, let each territory decide for itself whether to be slave or free, whether as it comes into the Union. Let them decide for themselves. In other words, he was a northern man, but he did not have extreme views on slavery. And his view became fairly popular for a time. Now, the issue of the Missouri Compromise, was it still applicable under the conditions that existed in the 1850s? I mean, the Missouri Compromise had been passed in 1820, but since then we'd acquired a whole lot of territory. President Franklin Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act that repealed the Missouri Compromise. Nebraska, as the Kansas-Nebraska, Nebraska would come in as a free state, and Kansas would come in as a slave state. No problem because there were no slaves living in Nebraska anyway. Now, as for Kansas, that's another issue we'll talk about in a few minutes, but that was an explosive issue that led to a whole lot of bloodshed. led to the term Bleeding Kansas. Because the Kansas sent, well, actually, I'll tell you part of the story now. Kansas sent a pro-slavery constitution to Washington to see if Washington would accept it, but the constitution they sent was so anti-slave, and it said that no person who believed that slavery was wrong was going to be allowed to vote or hold office or serve on juries or serve